Good afternoon. I'm Ben Hobbs. Welcome back to the Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Fellow members Scott Harvey and Jim Bushnell are with me. And this afternoon we have two topics, one on system market power analysis, which once again, St. Guillermo Bautista will be presenting because this is his third presentation today. He's definitely a candidate for beatification. And then at 2:15 roughly, we'll be talking about resource adequacy enhancements, focusing on the import provision of that proposal. It's a proposal we'll hear a lot about in the next year or so. Okay, Guillermo, it's all yours.
Okay, let's go through the last one. And this is a follow-up that we have regarding one topic that was discussed previously. I actually want first to acknowledge the work that one of my employees have done. She's a relatively new employee to the CAISO. She was actually in the academia before coming to the ISO, young one. And she has a PhD, a master in electrical engineering, so is very familiar with the topic from the MIT. And I hope that in the future she's going to be taking this place rather than me going all the length. So this topic, as I indicated, is a follow-up that we had from a previous discussion on the MSc related to system market power. And what we want to cover in this presentation is some analysis we are doing, and there has been a lot of discussion related to how do we measure market power, what is the threshold to determine that we have to do proactively something, or how many hours of failure may be still okay, or what else do we need to do. And I think the first part that is key to have this discussion is to make sure that we can rely on a metric that is reflective of the conditions. And through the material, I'm going to go through some different areas that we have explored, and everything is around how we come with a metric that could be reflective of identifying conditions for system market power. This is just a follow-up, and there has been some standard metrics that the Department of Market Monitoring puts in place to track the system market power structural conditions for system market power. And this is the well-known RSI, the Residual Supply Index metric. Last year, we have some discussion in this precise forum about the concerns that, given the conditions that we have observed recently in the system, there may be this likelihood for structural market power. And I believe this is the standard metric to come with a quantification of the likelihood for that to happen. We have first tried to approach the same metric, the same basis used by the Department of Market Monitoring to have the same starting point. And from there we go into what we believe could be useful information to explore to get a better sense of what we really have in the system. The complication or the challenge is not really about the specific calculation of the residual supply index. It's a very well-defined metric and very standard. The challenges arise when you have to determine what data you are going to use. And you can take different assumptions, different approaches, and that is what can make a difference in reaching a specific value and potentially different conclusions. That is the really first part that we wanted to tackle to explore that area. Once we continue to use the RSI as a good metric to quantify the likelihood for this to happen, what are the assumptions that really make sense to make in order to come with that specific metric? And the RSI is a very well-known formula. It's just telling you if you take into account all the supply and all the demand that you have to account in your system, and if you subtract the amount associated for each resource, for each participant, are you still able to meet your demand with the remaining supply? And in that sense, you can quantify that with a very simple metric, that is the RSI, that is just the coefficient of taking the leftover supply once you subtract the M pivotal supplier against your demand of the system. Okay, in this sense, we have basically three components: the total supply, the total demand, and the specific groups of what makes a supplier, the scheduling coordinator in this case. When we started to track this metric, we have these three different inputs, I would say, where you can elaborate. And again, our starting point is to try to match the metric from DMM based on the results of 2017. If we go component by component, we have first the system demand. How do we account for the system demand? We take the day-ahead load forecast plus the upward ancillary service requirement. That would be regulation app, operating reserves, and that is composed of spin and non-spin reserves. That is somehow all the requirement that the market needs to meet with available supply.
Second, does that include transmission system losses in demand?
No.
Okay, so that's not everything.
Yeah, this is one of the many specific items that you may start playing with to account or not, and this is exactly where we want to go. The total system supply, on the other end, is obviously the supply that we have available, but what that is exactly? Well, we have the energy bits, and there are some nuances between the day ahead and the real time. Energy bits doesn't mean it's the total capacity we have in the system available. For the fact that we optimize energy and ancillary services, there may be some conditions in which you don't need to have an energy bid to submit a bid for a AS service. So that could be still capacity that is available because at the end of the day it's used to meet your requirement for upward ancillary services. This metric, all in all, only accounts for the energy bids that are available. So there may be some additional capacity that is associated only with bids for ancillary services that are not factored in as of these 2017 metrics.
Energy bids, do you mean incremental energy and minimum load, or just incremental energy?
Is all the capacity up to the upper bound of the bid that somehow is going to already account for the PIMing capacity. And obviously you have to take into account all the types of generation that we have internal to the system, that we do the conventional generation, different technologies. We do take into account the batteries, for instance, they can provide some supply, and all this type of new technology. So anything that is supply is accounted in the bid stack. And that also includes the interties. Now, for the interties, and this is some communication we have had with DMM, we don't, at least the metric that we are doing from the ISO side, we only take into account the interties that effectively add supply to the bid stack. There are some interties associated with wheels that is just passing through energy in the system. They don't add any flexibility, any supply to the system, but they are bids. So we filter those out. In terms of the supplier, there is a definition that we have in the system to recognize the mapping of the affiliates. If you may have one entity that has 2, 3 different scaling coordinators, we make sure that all of them are treated as one single supplier. And there is some logic also to identify the ones that are net buyers, right? And we basically don't apply the test to those that are net buyers because their net position is a buyer. So these are the assumptions taken to come with the information needed to run these calculations through the RSI. Yes, sir.
Hey, this is Perry. Could you just explain what you mean by including import wheels? Because I thought you just said I think I heard, the way I understood what you said was that you don't include import wheels.
ISO calculation doesn't include the wheels because it doesn't add capacity. There was some previous discussion with DMM, and at some point I understood that they were including, but apparently they are not including either. So it should be, yeah, Amelia?
This is Amelia Blanke from DMM. Just to be totally clear about this, we are screening out wheels, but there are different ways of identifying wheels. So it is possible that our analysis still includes a subset of potentially wheeling transactions.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. Yes.
Steve Keen, Navigant. Does the system demand include exports?
Let me hold the answer for that question. Well, just to be specific about this set of assumptions based on the 2017 results, they do not. Okay, and now this is a perfect venue to start going into the discussion, right? I just introduced the elements that, good or bad, these are the ones that have been considered so far in the calculation of the RSI metrics. And that was our starting point to start developing different different indices based on the same logic. The first question, obviously, you have two components, the demand and the supply. There is more than one way to think about what the demand should be. Take as granted that we have to meet the upward and shared services, regulation, and operating reserves. The question now is more for the conforming load. What do you account to be the load, the demand? And this metric this plot has a lot of information altogether, but let me try to elaborate. So if we're talking about the day-ahead market, the bit stack that you have for the demand actually could be the amount of self-scheduled demand, the amount of self-scheduled exports, and then a range of economical demand. That could include exports, internal demand, it could include virtual demand, you name it, anything that is price responsive. So this would be a typical curve that we have to take into account in the day-ahead market, including to some extent the portion of the capacity that has to be used to support the provision of the upward and shared services. One option is, well, there are many options. This is just the stack of the demand for the day-ahead, the integrated forward market. Now I overimpose different references here. One option could be just forget about this demand curve and take whatever is the IFM clear. This is effectively what the day-ahead market clears in the integrated forward market. That is what was determined economically to be the optimal point to clear in the day-ahead market. That could be one reference to think of what the demand should be. Good or bad, that is what the market considers to be optimally clear when we run the market. A different approach could be, well, forget about what the bidding was. Let's try to make sure that we are able to meet the forecasted load for the day-ahead market time frame. And in that case, it would be the load forecast that is used in the ROC process. It's a day-ahead forecast. That doesn't have any component of price-responsive elements, but is the best forecast we have in the day-ahead time frame. That would be another option to consider what the demand should be. And actually, this is the one that is currently being used in the RSI calculation. Another option could be, well, the day-ahead is running too much ahead in advance. How good is it going to be to actually capture the actual condition of the real time? Well, we can turn and instead start using the real-time load forecast. That is going to be closer to the actual, right? It's closer to the real time and it's going to be more accurate in that sense. Or we can actually say, okay, forget about the forecast, forget about the bidding, let's just go with the actual demand. We know what actually happened, good or bad the forecast in the day ahead of real time, we don't care, we just go with what actually the system has to meet in real time. These are all the variations you can think of what the demand should be. And one or the other is going to potentially lead to different results because it's going to be based on different values. So the question is, which one is the one that makes more sense? Now, let me stretch this a little bit even more. And this is something that it may be useful to get from the MSc. Right now, the metric that is developed is using day-ahead information. Day-ahead bids, day-ahead demand. It's because it's the easiest way to take as a reference the day-ahead to measure actually what is going to be a real-time concern, or is the concern exclusively in the day-ahead market? And I ask this because if we are going to be in the time frame of the day ahead, the day ahead information is going to tell us the best reference of what the actual market has to face with. The point I'm trying to make here is that if we just confine for a moment only to the day ahead market, we don't need to worry too much about the clear demand in the IFM or the load forecast in the day ahead. we want to be concerned about the portion of the demand that could be exposed to market power. In that sense, if we go back to the stack that we have here for the demand, you have all these components. The amount of outward requirements for shared services, plus the self-scheduled demand, plus the self-scheduled exports, these are non-price responsive demand components. No matter what the price is going to be, they most likely are going to clear because they are signaling that. These are self-schedules and they are not going to react to the price. If there is a participant that can hijack the price to $1,000, they are willing to take it. Well, that is only for this portion, the self-schedule, the non-price responsive component. As we start moving into the economical range, this is bidding demand with a price-defined reference level. They are going to react to the price, and if the price is too high, they are going to clear accordingly. So bidding demand is a good way to curve market power. So when we're talking about what the demand should be in consideration for the estimation of market power in the day-ahead market, should we really be concerned about the day-ahead forecast or the economical range when we know that only this portion of the non-price responsive demand is the one that is going to really be held hostage to the price? Any other component is going to be price responsive, and inherently they are going to curve the market power. So this is one variation that we also have, saying what is really the minimum demand that is going to be subject to this market power. All the economical range is going to react to that according to the market clearing process.
Well, but I think we're concerned about, we want people to bid into the day-ahead market, and we don't want them to withhold supply because they're going to be market power exercise. I mean, I think we want to look at, you know, the day-ahead forecast, the real-time forecast, and the actual load, all of them, and apply them to the supply available in the day-ahead market and see whether there's market power. So that's my view, and the only thing I'd want to do is include losses and
so a couple points. I guess, so you've drawn these lines for representative purposes, but it's not necessarily going to be in this order, right?
It could be in that order, yes.
And I think, you know, this your discussion about downward sloping demand, curbing market power, you know, is right to a degree. I guess it illustrates the shortcomings of an index like the RSI in a world where you actually had elastic demand. But when you're talking about a day-ahead market, you always have to be careful about what exactly is a downward sloping day-ahead demand curve, because most of it is not true demand reduction. It's just shifting load to the real time. And that's where, you know, really what we want a full picture of is just the supply-demand relationship going into the day-ahead market, what sort of the aggregate is across all the markets would look like. And if we're confident that all of the supply or a reasonable expectation higher market supply will be present in the day-ahead market, because the must offer requirements, then it does seem like you want basically different measures of the expected total demand and the expected total supply, and you want to compare those two things and not really worry about the downward sloping aspect of it. I guess I don't fully have my head around exactly how to think about imports and exports with regards to what you reasonably would expect to be offered in the day-ahead market versus, say, real time. If we were consistently getting more imports in real time, for example, for whatever reason, then maybe we would be underrepresenting the total supply by comparing just the day-ahead sort of offer curve with the expectation of real time. But I think that's not the case. I think that if we do think of the offers into IFM as representative of what we should expect being available, then comparing it to, you know, either, and I guess you look at all of these because the RUC forecast and real time and the actual load can all be all over the place, and so you want to kind of consider the circumstances in which actual load may be well above the RUC forecast and what's going on there.
Okay. I think we are going to the same expectation then, because the way we approached this analysis was that instead of fixing it to a specific set of conditions, we wanted to have more a type of sensitivity analysis, right? If you have all these moving pieces, well, let's see what the scenarios you get with all these moving pieces taken into account. And this is exactly what we did. Yes.
Hi, Steve Keene from Navigant again. When you talk about IFM cleared demand, does that include virtual demand? Are you excluding that, or?
In the current metric that has been developed so far by the Department of Market Monitoring, virtual supply or demand is not included. But we have some scenarios where we account for that.
And here, actual demand is the actual real-time consumption, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it wouldn't have virtual.
Okay. That is from the side of the demand. Concurrently, we also have the other side, that is the supply. What do we take into account for supply? And let me go back to what the current metric is relying on. When we talk about supply, there are different ways, similarly to demand, to consider what the available supply is. And I would try to avoid mixing the concept versus the practical implementation that we have, but at some point we have to live with what we currently have implemented in the market. You can think in the sense of tier approach. First, you have participants submitting bids. In the economical range, at any price, they can self-schedule with the flexibility that we provide them. At the end of the day, it's about how much capacity is being made available through the different types of bids. Self-schedules, economical, is up to the PMAX. No doubt that we have to take into account the PMAX available for those resources. Once those bids that I would prefer to be raw bids, because they are coming from the participants, we cannot just take those bids as is and consume those in the market. They are consuming the market, but they are not the straightforward use in the optimization. There is something that what we call pre-processing, because we have to make sure that it aligns with all the rules that we have. What is all this pre-processing? For instance, a participant by default may be submitting daily bids every single hour of the day, and they may have an outage for 3 hours. Well, the pre-processing has to make sure that for these 3 hours, these bids are basically made unavailable because, there are bids submitted, but the resource is not available. In other hours, the resource may be derated to lower than the PMAX. We have to go and specifically for the period of the derate, bring the PMAX to the level where it's really available. And so on and so on. We have all these pre-processing steps to make sure that the bids that are going to come into the market for the optimization are reflective of the actual available supply. Now, this is one-time deal. We are solving for 24 hours in the integrated forward market. Is one-time deal in an hourly basis. It's optimized with all the temporal constraints. And there may be bids as granular as 1 hour. When we solve the day-ahead market, we solve not just the dispatch, but also the unit commitment. It's one single deal that we have to come with as part of the solution. In order to arrive to that solution, we have different preprocessing. And one more step of what we do by the time we go into the optimization is to define what is the available capacity for each resource that is going to be subject in the optimization. Let me put a pause here to try to elaborate more in the context of the real time, because that is more intuitive to understand. In the real time, we're optimizing every 5 minutes and updating every 5 minutes. We know where the unit actually is because we read the telemetry, the state estimator, we know exactly where it is. We make a projection where it should be in 5 minutes later by the time we start running the market. From there, we know how far the unit can actually go up or down. The RTD already made up the decisions of what the unit should be online, which one should be shut down. It's only a matter of moving marginally in the operational range of the units. It has nothing to do with commitments. It's just about dispatches. Because of this logic, it makes sense that the market can perfectly define what is the band in which the unit can be dispatched based on the current point of operation. So part of the optimization, preparation of the optimization is to define those tolerance bands. Based where it is, how far can go up and down based on the RAM capability. This is going to tell us where the unit can operate, and now it's up to the optimization to define where it should fall in the operating instruction. When you move that concept of the real time into the day-ahead market, things don't hold nicely. Because in the real time, you know what unit is online. You know the status of every single unit. You know exactly where the unit was 5 minutes ago, and you can just update that condition. The day ahead is different. We are solving all 24 hours in one single shot. You can assume that if the unit is online in hour ending 1, you can follow one trajectory and assume that the unit can be anywhere in that range. The concept that we have of what is the capability of each resource for the current interval or the current hour holds nicely only for the real time. For the day ahead, there is no guarantee that that is going to be actually the available capacity. You change the condition of the hour ending 1, and you can get completely different solution for hour ending 24. It's everything to optimize. Commitment makes a huge difference in that assumption. We have one single engine to run the day ahead and the real-time market. The same outputs are somehow generated for day ahead and real-time market, the same data components. The usefulness of some components only makes sense for the real time, not much for the day ahead. And this is where we start having some concerns of what data may be used as of now for the calculation of the RSI. Let me try to elaborate more on this with this illustration. This is an example of a day ahead market. Let's assume the day ahead market, a specific resource has a bid submitted for 300 megawatts all day long, every single hour. If we just stop there and think, what is the capacity that is available for the market? We could say, well, 300 megawatts all day long. We can actually use that capacity to determine how much we have to use from there to meet our demand. Let's assume now that the profile, the trajectory in red, is the day-ahead solution, the dispatches the schedule that we determine to be optimal for the day-ahead market. If we follow the concept that I just explained for the real time, for every hour, we are going to say, okay, if the unit is operating at this point, it can go up this far or it can go down this far. I didn't put a downward trajectory, but it's similar. So you create this band based on where the unit is optimally clear. But that upper limit is only depending on what the decision was made to dispatch the resource. If I would say, instead of starting the unit in hour ending 2, I start the unit in hour ending 1, I can get access to more capacity sooner. The fact that I'm saying that for hour ending 3, for instance, the unit can only ramp up to this point is because the market already optimally decided that it was the most economical dispatch to keep the unit flat at this point. It doesn't mean that if some conditions change, now that capacity is not accessible. If I have resources dropping from the system and now I have to optimize the system, this dispatch is going to be different. And therefore, this capacity now may be actually available for this hour. So by relying on the fact that I'm going to take only the upper capacity that was predetermined based on the optimal solution, I'm missing capacity to account in the calculation of the RSI. There could be even a worst case when the unit actually cycles. Let's assume this unit has a 3-hour minimum downtime. Typically, that is a very nice profile that we have in the system. The morning ramp push some resources to be committed, the prices justify that commitment, then at the middle of the day we have all the integration of solar, prices come to negative or very low to zero, close to zero, resources are shut down, we have to bring them up for the evening pool, and prices are reasonable to be in the morning. That is a very typical profile we are going to see for conventional resources. Typically, we are going to see resources shut down for 5-6 hours in the middle of the day and ready to be for the evening pool. Let's assume this resource has 3-hour minimum downtime. Strictly speaking, once I shut down the unit, no matter what, I cannot bring the unit online after 3 hours, but because that is a physical limitation of the unit, a temporal constraint. If the unit was shut down, let's say 5 hours, in all these 5 hours, I am assuming that the available capacity for that resource is effectively zero, because it's offline, so there is nothing available for that resource. But, again, if I change the conditions of the market, now this resource may be actually dispatched in a way that it just bridge from the morning peak to the evening peak and it's not shut down. That capacity is actually available. So, relying on the upper limitation that the market generates is going to be underestimating, in general, the capacity that is available. And I think the genesis of this concern is that these upper limits that are used for the calculation rely or are dependent on what the solution was. We change the conditions, the solution is going to be different, and the access to the capacity is going to be different. The question then is going to be, what does it make sense to take into account?
Can I just, there's a lot of information there, and I want to kind of sort out, the first thing you talked about was much of what you're talking about are things that are endogenous to the market solution, and that's problematic, but it sounded like some of the pre-processing is taking care of things that are exogenous in the sense that there's like a generic offer quantity, but then we know the unit's going to be on outage for certain specific hours. And you referred to that as the pre-processed. So in a figure like this, I thought that was the green line, but it sounds like it's kind of some hybrid of, of the blue line and the green line in a sense.
Let me step back. Actually, there are different steps. There are different steps, not just one step of pre-processing. You have the original bits as it is, 300 megawatts. Then the first round is to internalize outages, the rates on availability to reflect what is really available. That is what actually goes into the optimization. Part of what we call the market solution or the output bits is this calculation, that is the green light, that basically tells you what is the upper bound to dispatch the resource for that specific hour. That is not really the pre-processed bit, it's already kind of part of the solution.
Okay, so conceptually in this picture, the blue line is the input bid after accounting for the D-rates and other exogenous adjustments to capacity. And the green is basically reflecting the limitations given what the red told gave the unit to have.
So I think this is the key point between a decision to be made what to use, whether it should be the raw bits, taking into account the outage and so on, versus this solution-dependent capacity. The caveat we have put in here is that this green light is an intermediate data step that we have as part of the solution. This is not really what is generated explicitly by the solution. It's just data for informational purposes, and it has some history why we have these fields in the output of the market. It's not reliable at 100% because, again, it depends on what the solution was. This field was actually developed day one for MRTU when we didn't even have MSGs. When you try to put these issues into the MSG, we never went back and adjust this calculation for the MSG, so it can give you anything. That effectively is going to take capacity away from the calculation because, again, it's solution-based. If you change the solution, assuming now, putting in context, right, we are going to take away the pivotal supplier number one. Well, this capacity is not going to remain constant because once you don't have those resources, the market is going to lead you to a different solution and the upper limit is going to be different. So it's a self-feeding problem if you rely on the solution.
It seems like the green line gives you a supply curve that if you didn't need the supply, it wouldn't be there. But if you needed the supply,
it can change.
It can go up to the blue line, right?
Yeah.
So we don't want the supply to appear to be low on a day where we didn't need the supply.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of is the analog to the previous discussion about this whole index is really not designed to deal with slopes of supply or demand curves. It's really meant to sort of test a kind of crude measure of just is total potential supply within a range of total demand. And or another way to think about it is if prices were just really, really high all the time, how much supply would be available? And yeah, I think we want to have this as a kind of high level sense of what that supply demand balance is without, and we can have that debate about whether another kind of index should complement it, but really the fundamental characterization of a pivotal supplier index is about just quantities. And these the other lines are representing really the outcome of a slope rather than the physical capability. So it does seem not consistent with kind of the spirit of what a pivotal supplier was intended to capture.
Okay. I think this is one of the key points and takeaways, because we have RSI estimations based on the pre-processed values versus the raw bit information that we have. And just to give you a glance of how different it looks like, if you take, for instance, this is a whole year, January 1st through December 31st, 2018. The upper part is if you take just the equivalent of the blue line here, the full available capacity. If you take the output bits, that is the pre-processed capacity available, and you can see that it's going to be shaped according to the dynamics of the market, right? You have less when you have the springtime because the system is not committing too many resources. They are not needed. You start racking up the dispatches in the summertime. So basically in the summertime, all the capacity is available, and we are going to see that the output and the input could be relatively close to one to the other. And you can see the input bits are going to remain somehow flat, because it's just the nominal capacity that is available versus the output bit that is going to be shaped by the system conditions. If we go more specific and just point to one specific day, this is the peak day that we have in 2018. This is July 24th, or I think so, July 24th, even though our peak was July 25th, I believe. This is the day where you can see that the two lines are going to come pretty close around the peak time, and it makes sense, right? We are talking about right now differences because of commitment. When you have a peak day, most likely you are going to be running very high, and you are going to basically have everything committed anyway. So the difference between the output and the input may be smaller, just because of the nature that you already have everything online. So it could be closer to be reflective of the actual capacity available. But for other hours of the day, like the early morning hours, when you don't need that much capacity, you can see that delta becomes quite significant. Oh, we have questions, yeah.
Operator, do we still have 2 questions on the phone?
Yes, we do. I'll open the first line.
Hi, this is Michelle Keto from the CTC. I just have a couple of questions and comments. So the first is, are you starting to thinking about this on a forward-looking basis? So, for example, at least 5 units have said that they're going to mothball in 2019 or have mothballed, including an almost 1,000-megawatt unit, which is La Paloma. So in terms of the supply stack, are you guys factoring that into consideration? That's my first question, and then I have another question.
Well, I think that is open for discussion. Right now, this metric is a historical metric, right? Whatever happened based on previous performance. I think the debate would be, if we want to start making projections of what that could be, we have to start going into a discussion of what assumptions we make. And yeah, we may know that some units are mothballed, some units are not going to be available, but what about the other factors that play into this? What demand do we assume? What supply or import do we assume? So making a projection is even a step further of complexity that we may entertain once we ground of what we should be doing, at least for the historical part.
Okay. And then my other issue is, do you plan on looking at bidding behavior? Because I know in some of the earlier reports there was some data about importers or some people bidding at $1,000. And then the other thing is, I was particularly interested in the DMM analysis that showed that net buyers are bidding significantly differently than net sellers. And in the case of some net sellers, they're bidding above their default energy bids. Will you guys be looking at that as well? Because I would think in a competitive market that shouldn't happen, right?
Well, I think this falls very naturally into the next topic of the RA imports, but I would say both the ISO and the Department of Market Monitoring do check on these bidding patterns and behavior, right? That is just part of the normal monitoring that is done day to day.
So my understanding is that bids like that are only mitigated if there's local market power, so if there's a constraint. But otherwise, they're not mitigated. Are you saying that they're monitored and referred? Like, let's say somebody bids regularly at $1,000. It's my understanding that there is no remedy for that.
Right now, the only mitigation that we have is local market power, and that is triggered only by local congestion. And when that happens, we have a mechanism already automated in the market to take care of the condition. The discussion we're having here is more on the capacity system market power that is in concept quite different to the local market power mitigation. And my answer to your previous questions was more in a general sense that we check across the market conditions, right? And one of them obviously is how the bids are coming into the system, what behaviors are there, or what trends are for bidding. That is something just generic of part of the monitoring of the market.
Okay, but if you did find market power and you thought people were bidding strategically, there's not really anything to do. Is that, I mean, I'm just trying to get at this. So, you know, yeah. So, I mean, I assume that we care about market power because we care about prices, right?
We do, and I think we are at the point of the discussion of let's first identify and measure what market power is, and then we will be able to discuss if there is any, what we do.
Okay, thanks.
And to add to that, you know, this is one. I don't actually consider this measuring market power. It's measuring sort of the structural conditions that might be indicative of the potential for market power. And I think there's still a lot of room for debate about exactly just how indicative it is. But it is sort of the standard that we've evolved to use, especially for the local market power mitigation. And it's really, you know, right now it's used on a day-to-day basis for the local market power mitigation. And so this index is kind of being created in the spirit of that. That's why it's not forward-looking. It's more sort of saying, okay, what did yesterday look like as far as the supply-demand balance goes? And yeah, I think the way the mitigation approach has been developed in California has been to identify that there are certain local markets where competition is not structurally viable, and therefore a strong-handed form of mitigation is required. And then there are others that it was assumed are more structurally competitive, and therefore heavy-handed mitigation is not called for, or all of these things, there's a cost to mitigation and then there's the potential benefit to it, and you sort of have to weigh the potential severity of the market power and the potential likelihood of the market power against the severity of the remedy. And so this is kind of an exploration of how much we should be worrying about system market power, and whether that underlying assumption that we've sort of operated the system under for 10 years is an appropriate assumption. I guess that's sort of what we're trying to figure out here.
Yeah. And if my phone is still open, I just want to say that in the context of thinking about that, you also want to look at the future. And so if you see lots of resources mothballing and taking out significant amounts of capacity, that's relevant, I think.
Yeah, but you can go forever on that, you know, because there might be new imports come in, there might be new units constructed, there might be more demand responding to that in storage, and so once you start thinking about future conditions, it's hard to know where to stop with that.
Okay, and so
that's not even. Well, I mean, another big part of this is the contractual relationship. So if load is contracting with supply, and you can completely change the net buyer, net seller sort of relationships as well. And that has a big effect on both these calculations and what we think the market outcomes would look like.
So you're saying that this analysis is saying whether the system itself is structurally competitive, which is the underlying assumption with to have no market mitigation. Is that right?
It's looking at whether for the previous year what those structural conditions looked like. Correct. I don't, and that is the basis for which we've kind of decided when to apply a stronger form of mitigation.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Operator, can you put the next caller through, please?
Caller, your line is open.
Hi, this is Weizer from SCE. I think, first one, thank you for this analysis or the proposed this calculation methodology. It's not clear to me whether this calculation could overstate the supply you can have. And it's not clear to me what the relationship in that calculation between the local supply versus system supply. For example, if you calculate RSI on a system level, ignoring all the transmission constraints between local areas, you may be able to find, the system has enough supply even with pivotal supply being removed. But however, if there is congestion, for example, or transmission constraints that would limit the excess capacity in the local area, but that could not get into the system, then I'm not sure if this calculation would be able to capture this type of scenario.
Well, I think this naturally will shift from a discussion of system market power to local market power. If you are saying that by assuming that we have all the bit stack available to meet the demand at any point on the system, is because we are taking the assumption that it's system-wide and there are no transmission limitations. But now if we go into the scenario where you have a constraint that is limiting to the extent how much you can use from one side to the other, effectively that should be basically subject to local market power, and we do have the mechanism to handle local market power.
I think maybe ask you about, suppose you had a gen packet suppose you had a generation packet in some part of California, would that trigger local market power in the rest of the state? Suppose we just had a wind generation area that had a few thousand megawatts that was constrained down. Would that trigger local market power in the rest of the state, or would that
It would trigger it everywhere where the load is upstream of that gen pocket, but the stuff in the gen pocket would not be mitigated.
Right.
And the mitigation would be taking place based on that local condition, right? It would be subject to the load that is in the upstream side only.
Yeah, but the local market power mitigation only tests the pivotal supply within that local area, local congestion area. But the system market power mitigation, I assume, will need to test the pivotal supply at the system level. But what I'm trying to say is, in this calculation, there's a dynamic between the local and system. So even, within that congested area, you may be able to find out the pivotal supply just within that local area. It could, trigger the local market power mitigation and then mitigate a bit for those units within that areas. However, if there are some extra, I'm just not clear then if you look at that same scenario, but at a system level, when you look at like a pivotal supply system level, and there's some supply on the uncongested area, but could not deliver to the congested area, which is part of the system load as well. So, then you probably have a situation where you have both local market power and also the potential for the system market power, when the two things are happening at the same time. I haven't thought through all of this, but I think there might be some case that would need to be investigated in that regard.
I don't know, it seems like if the local market power is triggered, then the local market power is triggered and people get mitigated, and the only people that wouldn't get mitigated would be the resources in the gen pocket, and by definition, they can't help because they're constrained down by transmission. So it wouldn't have any impact on, their bids wouldn't matter anyway. So I guess the question is, you know, would the local market power tool be triggered by congestion in out of a gen pocket or not? I mean, it seems to me if it's triggered, then that would take care of the problem. If it's a possibility that we could have a gen pocket that wouldn't trigger, then we could say, okay, how often do we have gen pockets that constrain down any of the resources we're talking about?
Yeah, I guess another way to, I agree with that, and it's, is there some, I think this whole exercise is kind of asking, is there some amount of market power that is not being captured by the LMPM screens? And I think the scenario, you know, I hear what you're saying, that like assuming the stuff can flow everywhere, it has its limitations, but I think that in all the scenarios I can come up with, as Scott said, the LMPM is triggering the stuff that the units that would have the market power under those scenarios. So the question is, are there any units that are going unmitigated by the assumption that system is competitive, even considering the types of constraints you've been thinking about?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. I think that fits my question much better, but I think it's still an open question in my mind.
Okay, thank you.
Operator, do we still have one other person waiting?
Sorry. I'm still on. Can you hear me?
We actually have 2 more people in queue at this time.
Follow up on that. Why don't we take a
Please.
Hi. This is Callie Wells with WPTF. So just to follow up on that conversation, so I guess the question in my mind is, if you do have a gen pocket where the capacity within that area can't flow everywhere, should we be, when you calculate available supply, should that capacity be reduced by some amount because of the physical constraints on the system, it isn't available to meet total demand?
That sounds to be more like once you have local market power, you separate the system into the regions, right? And you know that the upstream side of the constraint is going to be taken care of with the local market power. And if now we take care of the other side of the equation, that will be the remaining. Can we do some RSI or market power on that smaller area? Is that what you're indicating?
No, I guess my question is, does it make sense when you're calculating on the system level, if we go down this path of an RSI, the available supply, should the supply within that gen pocket somehow reflect the fact that it isn't fully available because of the transmission constraints?
I guess the question is if the congestion if the resources on the constrained upside and get mitigated when the gen pocket exists and be subject to a 3 pivotal supplier test, then we don't need to worry about that because there's no gap in the mitigation design. Mm-hmm. And the hypothetical we're thinking about is all those times when the price goes to $1,000 and there's no congestion across California. So the question is there system market power when there is no congestion? I think that's the hypothetical we're talking about. And then a separate question, which Jim and I have been raising, is maybe we ought to make sure that the way the local market power mitigation is structured would, in fact, trigger mitigation if there were a gen pocket that created local market power.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think. You could cook up a scenario where maybe outside of the gen pocket, ownership is distributed in such a way that you don't trigger the pivotal supplier everywhere upstream of that gen pocket, but it seems...
That would mean there's not market power. I mean,
yeah, by definition of what... right. That's a good point.
Okay. Do we have any other questions?
We do.
Okay.
Operator, can we put the next caller through, please?
Hi there, it's Mark Holman with PowerX. Good afternoon. Just when I'm looking at this analysis, it's interesting data. I guess I think it was said well that I really look at this data, and rather than looking at it as system market power, it's really analysis of the supply bids and the demand or the demand bids. But it's really tough for me when I'm thinking about system-wide supply versus demand to separate out three different issues. You know, is it system-wide local power? Is it scarcity? Is it a resource adequacy issue? And I think all three are interrelated, and I think you could take these same curves and you could use them to say, well, how often are we running into a scarcity issue? And looking at what some other markets are doing in terms of improving or enhancing their scarcity pricing mechanisms. I know PJM filed something last week. If this is happening where you're getting down to 500, 1,000, 2,000 megawatts or 1 or 2% of your remaining supply, and that's happening 50, 100, 150 hours a year, or less than 1% of the year, I think most people would say, well, that's a measurement of scarcity in the market, not a measurement, not an analysis of system-wide market power. I think if it's happening very frequently, then it starts to become a resource adequacy issue. Well, why are we encountering scarcity conditions so often where we're getting down to 500 megawatts, 1,000 megawatts, et cetera, left in system-wide supply offers beyond demand? And so it's tough to have a discussion on supply versus demand at a system-wide level without talking about all three pillars, which is kind of, well, is this a system-wide market power issue, or is it a scarcity issue, and we need more robust scarcity pricing to encourage voluntary demand on the enterprise, to encourage demand response, to encourage imports, investment in new resources? Is it a resource adequacy issue where the resource adequacy program is not robust enough that we're getting those future retirements and we're getting scarcity conditions too often? And so just one thought. I had a second comment as well on the supply side, but I'll wait to hear your response.
Oh yeah, I think this is a very good thing that we have actually been discussing internally. And I think there are stages in which we have to have the discussion. And we are in the very stage of trying to make our mind what would be a good way to somehow estimate the likelihood of structural conditions for market power. At this stage, we are not even going that far into, is this an RA problem? We have had these discussions whether this is just reflecting a scarcity condition, right? And when you see the results, you are going to find that typically in the days where you have the most of the hours failing the test are our peak days, when we have basically every single thing online and we are just scratching the surface to meet our demand. So is that a scarcity condition? Well, that raises a very good question, because if you have everything already available and is up and running, what else can you get? And what would you get with a mechanism to apply market power mitigation when you have that type of condition? So I think we're just scratching the surface of this topic, and I wouldn't like to deviate too much from this first discussion that is really the analysis that we have done so far, and we can then go into the other areas of more policy that I'm sure Greg and Brad and Perry are going to be very happy to chat.
I appreciate that, Guillermo. I guess the second question I had was on the supply side, is that the CAISO's day-ahead market, which I think you're analyzing here, does run at 10 a.m. and doesn't print out results till around 1 p.m. It is a voluntary market on the interties through the intertie bidding framework, and I think it's going to be very difficult to calculate the supply that could be out there, and I think that needs to be thought through when you start talking about mitigation versus what other markets are doing, which is in those scarcity type conditions, looking at operating reserve demand curves, additional flex reserves that go into the operating reserve demand curves, and looking at more robust pricing as opposed to mitigation. And the reason I mention those timelines is that the stronger the price signal, the more likely you're going to get entities buying gas in the morning before your market runs, potentially committing units from outside of the CAISO BA to offer into the market. And the more that price signals are suppressed on those scarcity condition hours, on those peak days, as you described it, the less likely you're going to get that supply in, even into your input bids. And so, again, recognizing that the CAISO BA is well connected with the rest of the West, you're not operating in a vacuum, and your market is coming sequential to a lot of the decisions that are being made. And so the very outcome of those prices it can have a material impact on what maybe gets offered in the next day, or the expectation of those prices, what gas gets procured and what units get offered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all good points. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let me speed up here a little bit. Oh, we have more questions. Okay.
Go ahead and put the next caller through.
Sorry, I'll try to be quick. This is Michelle Keto from CPC again. So just so I understand it, I always thought that there was only mitigation in local areas if there was congestion if it was higher than the system market price. But if the system market price is higher, then there is no mitigation. That was my understanding. Is that right?
I wouldn't characterize it that way. The local market power is going to be based whether the constraint that is binding is considered to be competitive. That means whether you have this load pocket or not. And if that competitiveness doesn't pass the test, then you apply the market power. And that somehow, there is a factor where you take the reference of what is the competitive versus non-competitive component of the price. But that is just the artifact of how we apply the mitigation rather than being the trigger for the mitigation.
Okay. Okay, but they're not
we've been trying to think through. Sorry, Michelle. We've been trying to think. Basically, you described the outcome that you would end up with only with mitigation when you have a local area that's congested in, and we were just trying to think about if that could ever have a lower price than the system unconstrained price, and maybe there's some weird scenario. But generally, we would expect under those circumstances the local area to have a higher price than the system price. But as Guillermo is describing, mechanically, the trigger for that is not a price trigger. It's the fact that there is a constraint, and it's a constraint that was deemed to have failed this kind of structural screen that we've been talking about.
Right, but we did have prices where the system was way higher than the prices in these congested areas, I think, over the summer. So I just want to make that one point. And then I just wanted to address the other issue about scarcity, and I absolutely agree that could be an issue that we're dealing with going forward. But at the same time, we're having potentially the scarcity. We're having resources saying that they're going to retire. So otherwise, in my mind, economic resources saying they're going to retire. And this is why I think that in discussion at the board meeting about market power mitigation and the RMR and CPM is so important. So I would just note that these are related and important issues. So thanks. I mean, because, I'm sorry, I'll just go a little further. The CPUC is considering opening up the procurement track, but does it make sense to authorize new procurement when you have generation just sitting on the sidelines? So that's just another point I'd like to make. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Steve from Navigate. I have a question about the way how the local market power mitigation works. If you have a gen pocket that basically congests in the sense that they can't ship everything out, but then you have the rest of the market, essentially the rest of the system. Is there a check done on the rest of the system for local market power? Or is it assumed, since it's, this is the question of how do they pick where to do the local market power mitigation or where to do that check? So if you have one gen pocket that congests going into the market, is the entire market checked for local market power and then mitigated?
No, this is just a local situation, and you always want to have the upside and downside down of the equation, right? And this is local market power mitigation. It's only going to trigger when that constraint is not competitive. That means you cannot have enough supply to basically meet your local condition. Do you want to?
Yeah, this is Ryan Kurlinski from DMM. It just depends on the details of what the shift factors are for, in calculating the RSI for a particular constraint. Right, you're calculating the effect, the counterflow that resources can provide. And so shift factors are based on distributed load, slack bus. And so if you're talking about a gen pocket, it depends what percentage of load is on the upstream side of that constraint. And so if you're talking about a pure gen pocket where there's no load upstream, then I'm trying to think through this on the fly. I think you get like maybe the RSI would be 0 over 0 So I'm not sure how that resolves, but so it depends on the details of the shift factors. So we have to
went through this when we implemented this. We're supposed to have multiple reference buses in the market power test specifically for that reason, so that it shouldn't matter where the generation is located relative to the distributed load reference bus. We went through that back in 2011. Remember?
Yeah, so that's right. Okay, so in this case, you're right. So the slack bus for the LMPM run is going to be outside the gen pocket, and so the shift factors are going to be 0 if you're talking about a pure gen pocket then. Yeah, so then the R side would be 0 over 0?
Over 0 and doesn't apply basically.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so one more.
Operator, can you put that last question through if they're still there?
Hi, this is Walter from SE. Sorry, somehow my line was broken, but I just had a second question that I didn't get a chance to ask. So in this calculation, I think eventually the market power, system market power, is really concerning about the procurement cost or the costs when you buy the demand, I guess, if the market is not competitive on the system level. But I think that we observed that the market price or the cost is really, I guess, strongly correlated to the net load. So in that sense, so I'm not clear about, if we just look at system level expected loads versus expected supply without considering the fact that the actual net load is setting the price, or the dispatchable resource to meet the net load is setting the price. So I'm wondering if this suggests like maybe a second type of system market power test where you look at the R side just among the dispatchable resources to meet net load, because other type of supplies like self-schedules or for whatever reasons may not be able to set a market price. So I just want to have your thoughts or feedback on that.
Yeah,
I agree with you. I think the pivotal supplier test doesn't make much sense when you include price-taking resources as being potentially withheld. But I mean, I think that's another level of discussion. We're focusing right here. I think the program was trying to stay focused on how we do the RSI test, and I think there are some other issues that we could get into once we get past that. And I think I agree with you that nuclear plants that are must run and wind that's in at 0 and other things that are offered in at 0, it doesn't make any sense to include them as calculation of supply that's going to be withheld. But that's let's save that discussion for another day.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Let me move quickly to the rest. So I want to get to the core of the analysis that we have done, and taking all these factors into account, you can see how relative the calculation can be depending on what assumptions and considerations you take into account. So short story, we came with 50 different permutations of calculations, taking all these variations of the demand, taking all these variations of the supply, and creating the calculation of the RSI 1, 2, 3 for every single scenario. And I think it's important because in that sense, given the fact that there are so many relative facts to consider, basing everything on one single scenario can be problematic and incomplete. I think having this type of sensitivity analysis can give you a spectrum of what the outcomes could be, and can give you a more informed picture of where we are in terms of this metric. So on the supply side, we take not just the output physical, that will be the pre-process. We take the output bit, discounting the net buyer, so basically not applying the test to the net buyer.
Why do you subtract out the supply of the net buyers? I didn't understand.
But this is just definition. What we are meaning with this is that the net buyer doesn't go through the test of the pivotal, but we take into account the supply. And then we have not just the output side of the bit, but also the input side. Then we take all the physicals for some scenarios, and we take the physical plus the virtuals for other scenarios. And when we move to the demand, we have the actual, the clear demand, the self-schedule, the day ahead versus real-time forecast. This is one single day. That is July 24th, RSI 1, 2, and 3. And here you have plotted the first 25 scenarios against all the permutations that we have. And obviously, depending on what permutation you want to rely on, you can end up in a complete different side of the spectrum. You can have some scenarios where you just rely on the output bit with no discount of the pivotal. That means the net buyer is still subject to the test. And you're going to see that they are going to be failing the test all the time because we don't have enough capacity to absorb the missing supply from the net buyers. To the point where you can have a very optimistic scenario where even the most critical day you are totally fine. You have an RSI way above 1 and there is no indication of a failure for an hour. Which one you prefer is depending on all the characteristics you want to take into account. As you move to the RSI 2 and RSI 3, you may get some of those scenarios now falling below the threshold of the 1 RSI, but still, there may be many scenarios where you fall below and many others where you are actually just fine. This is the metric just to summarize. If we apply any of the 25 permutations that we indicated, how many hours in the 2018 year we would have the RSI test failing? Here you have 25 scenarios. There are 25 more scenarios on the right-hand side. The only difference between these two sets is that in this one we take only this type of demand. This other scenario we take this same type of demand plus the export self-schedule. And the logic behind this is that we have seen historically in the market that there are some exports that just self-schedule in the system. They are willing to take the price. And in some cases, they actually have high priority self-schedule. That means they're going to go along with the load when things have to get tight. So here you just have 50 different scenarios with all these permutations. And you can see, right, if you just go with the physical output, the output bits only taking into account the physical resources against any of the permutations of the demand, you are going to see a lot of hours in which the test fail. If you end up with another scenario where you take all the raw input bit, all the capacity that is available through the bits, and you include the virtual supply that effectively can add to the bit stack, you can end up with 0 hours in many of the cases considered here. Where you want to draw the line is subject to the discussion of which scenario is most likely to be reflective of what we want to capture here. So far, we have all these scenarios, different ranges of outcomes, and therefore potential different conclusions depending which one you want to use. At the end of the day, I believe if you go with the RSI 3, for instance, and you explore any of the permutations, you can see that, yeah, on the RSI 3, there will be hours no matter what the scenario you're going to take where the test is failed. Because once you deduct the top 3 suppliers, you are going to be in such a tight condition. And if you are dealing with days where you have the peak load of the year, most likely these are the days, hours in which you are going to fail the test, no matter what permutation you take into consideration.
Guillermo?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Perry. Could you just clarify on this, which one of these cells is the DMM metric?
It would be the day ahead forecast. It would be this row, and it would be the output physical minus net buyers. It would be the third column, the second row. It would be this one.
Minus net buyers. I thought you said it isn't. You are correct.
Yeah. It's excluded from the test. So it would be this intersection between the second row and the third column.
And does the RT forecast row include, is that the RUC, or is that just a forecast of, or is that the same thing? I'm trying to think.
The day ahead forecast is equivalent to, say, RUC forecast.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yes, Mark.
Thanks, Guillermo. It's Mark Smith at Calpine. So this is the number of hours where it appeared that the RSI was less than 1.
Yes.
Would that create an overlap with the implementation of local market power? In other words, could local market power have already been triggered during these hours?
It could, yeah, because if there is congestion, it's an independent condition of the system market power evaluation we are doing. This is just system-wide supply demand, right?
Thank you.
And that is regardless of what congestion exists in the system.
Thanks.
Yeah. Just to try to put closure to this, so far everything is based on the day ahead. Originally, we were thinking, how can we go and do some evaluation for the real time? Well, the real time becomes even more challenging because once you are in the real time frame, you are so limited. You don't have the capability to commit resources, to move resources. You just have to deal with whatever you got. So just for a comparison, here you have the two lines of the day-ahead market, with and without a virtual supply, versus what would be the supply if you apply the real-time bid stack. And you can see that the real-time bid stack, because it's just based on what resources are already committed or can be committed within that short time frame, is going to be shaped according to the profile of the day. And you are going to be just moving on the margin of clearing the market. So it's becoming even more challenging to try to do something explicitly with what is available in the real time. The question that raises is there any need to go into the real time if we have some guarantee that whatever is available in the day-ahead market is actually showing up in the real time? We did this comparison for one day's illustration and see what capacity, what supply was available in the real-time market that was not showing up in the day ahead. And you're going to see that most of that capacity, that is not that much in relative terms if you have a day of 45,000+ megawatts of peak. We're talking about a delta between day ahead and real-time bid supply of no more than 2,000 megawatts. And most of that is coming with a self-scheduled price. It's basically self-scheduled. When you see the breakdown of that, you are going to see that that self-schedule is composed of wind, solar, renewable resources, and half of that is also from imports. This is the capacity that shows up in the real time that was not in time for the day ahead. The portion of the renewables is quite expected because we know that in the day ahead time frame, typically we see this under scheduling of the renewable resources. And here, once you are in the real time, most likely you're going to get the full production of those resources.
Well, back to my earlier discussion about thinking about the day-ahead supply-demand balance, and I was saying that if we would want to think about, are we confident that all of the supply bid into the day-ahead market is representative of sort of the total set of supply we would see across all markets? And PowerX pointed out that imports, there's a story at least where imports might be more responsive in the face of higher prices. And then this seems to be another data point that the day-ahead supply curve is maybe consistently understating what we could reasonably expect from at least renewable supply.
Do we have any questions on the phone? No? Well, that's all what I have. Thank you for your time.
All right, we're now feeling the repercussions of Ben giving everybody extra time for lunch and running about a half hour late.
Thank you, Guillermo.
Guillermo's long day is over now.
He gets a good weekend. So, Chris, start us off on our 12 or however many month discussion of resource adequacy enhancements. And we're going to start off today with import provisions.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. So I'm here to talk a little bit about RA enhancements. Our first time coming to the MSC on this one. There are quite a bit of items, large amount of scope on this initiative. So I just want to go over that really quickly, and then we're going to try to focus today on import provisions first and foremost, and then we'll have some additional discussions with the MSC as we go forward on this initiative on some of the other concepts. So the idea for this initiative is to really be a holistic review and reform of our RA processes and provisions, and it includes the following items in the scope. We're going to have some discussion of RA counting and eligibility rules, system and flexible capacity assessments and adequacy tests. We're going to review our must-offer obligations as well as the outage and substitution rules. We're going to review our import provisions as well as our maximum import capability provisions as well. And then we're going to talk about local capacity assessments with availability limited resources, and then meeting our local capacity needs with slow demand response, and finally, CPM and other backstop enhancements that would be related to the potential changes that we would make in some of these other items under scope. Does any MSC members want to have any questions about any of the scope items at this point? Each one could really take quite a bit of time to talk through, so I think let's just jump into the actual presentation today.
Just for perspective, Chris, so the import provisions that was part of the first of two tranches in the proposal, I guess, back in December, and reading the comments and looking at your slides, it looks like there's been some evolution in thinking about the import provisions since the proposal. Is that right? So I'm not sure what would be the right time to talk about what the ISO is thinking now versus what was in the last proposal. But
yeah, I mean, anytime you guys want to jump in on that, that's fine with us, I think. But yeah, we have been trying to think about it more, and have had conversations with many folks about these already. So we've got new ideas and some possible modifications for our next revised draw proposal.
Okay.
So yeah, feel free to jump in about anything that piques your interest there. But again, so just to kind of tee up the discussion, right now we have some potential concerns related to current import provisions for RA. Really the intent is try to ensure that import RA is available to provide required reliability services, and there is some concern if import RA resources potentially represent either double counting or speculative supply, because that might cause us to be a little bit worried that we couldn't actually ensure that those can be relied upon to deliver when they're actually needed. And then we have some initial analysis that does suggest that some non-delivery of import RA is actually a valid concern. So let's show that slide real quick and discuss that. So this has been some analysis that Danielle and Megan have worked on for their intertie deviation initiative, and we had just tried to parse that out and look at the RA component of the undelivered or non-delivered intertie energy. So this is from the HASP to real time, and then the bars are all in megawatt hours, and as you can see in some of the months like June, August, September, May, they have some pretty significant amounts, between 10 and 20% of the actual non-delivered intertie energy is actually coming from RA resources that have been shown on RA showings.
And just to remember, this is stuff that would have been bid into HASP and then not or cleared HASP and not tagged, basically. Okay.
Yep, Danielle and Megan are nodding their heads back there.
And the RA requirement requires a bid into HASP. Is that what, or?
So the RA requirement actually requires a bid into the day-ahead market, and then anything that clears the day-ahead market, then we'll have to rebid in the real time. That's also something I want to talk with you guys about as well, because we are thinking about that might be one solution or one potential modification that could help. But we're still exploring some of these potential solutions. But this is just our first cut on some analysis we think actually does indicate that there could be some issues here, and we want to, discuss if there's additional analysis that we might want to look into.
I mean, one thing I think you ought to look into is this any different than what's happening with all the imports? I mean, is this just the phenomenon of when they clear at $500 in HASP and then they see that RTD, the price is 12, no one delivers. And is it any different between the RA resources and the non-RA resources? Because they're only a small percentage of it, and suppose it's the RA resources are doing the same thing everybody else is.
Same proportion, yeah.
When the price is ridiculously low in real time, then that wouldn't really be a RA-specific problem. It'd just be the generic. They're not dumb enough to deliver when the price of power is that low.
And that's fair. So I think that's why we're not saying that this necessarily is a certain issue here, but we're saying it could indicate that. And so I'll just jump forward a bit here and talk a little bit about what other analysis we might want to look into to try to parse out some of those concerns and possible differences there that you mentioned, Scott. So what we're thinking about we could look at is potentially looking at bids, clearing prices and awards in the day ahead, HASP, and then actual final outcomes for delivery, scheduled and delivery, to try to, and then compare that between the actual just, normal intertie imports and then the actual shown RA, import RA as well. So that's kind of one of the ideas that we have. We're not quite sure of exactly the right analysis to do at this point. And then, we also just don't know what's behind some of the actual transactions, the pricing and stuff outside of the ISO's data that we have. So that kind of complicates it a bit as well. Let me go back though. So let's talk a little bit about what do we mean by speculative supply. In the context of import RA, we're talking about really primarily the idea that we could have non-resource specific RA imports, which is a type of import that's allowed under the tariff today, providing energy bids that aren't actually supported by physical supply or firm transmission. And that could result in a failure to deliver energy if the scheduling coordinator can't actually locate a real, supply in real time if there's a shortage. And the other concept we wanted to mention there is that it could really raise a concern of displacing internal resources that would have been procured otherwise by maybe perhaps a cheaper import RA resource that doesn't have the same comparable level of requirements placed upon them.
And right now, if that happened, they would just enter into the RAIM penalty structure? Is that?
Well, that's a good question. I believe for these non-resource specific RA imports, I don't know if RAIM applies to those. I don't believe it does.
So there's no consequence
I apologize.
whatsoever for not delivering import RA?
Well, the only consequence I believe at this point would just be the buying back of the energy, that the actual market outcome, settlement outcome there, but not the incentive mechanism for RA.
What if I didn't bid it into the day ahead market in the first place? Then I wouldn't even have to buy anything back, would I? Yeah, but I believe in that case you would be out of compliance with the tariff if you didn't provide your bid that's required under the MOU for any import RA, but not necessarily a RAIM penalty at that point.
No, this is Greg. They do have the same must-offer obligation as all internal resources, and then the RAIM applies equally to them. The only difference for import RA resources is that if they don't clear the day-ahead market, then they no longer have that offer obligation into real time. But they do have the offer obligation to day-ahead, so if they're not meeting their RA obligation into day-ahead, they would get assessed a RAIM penalty.
I think the question was, if they did offer day-ahead, cleared, but then didn't flow in real time, is there a RAIM penalty or not?
No, because RAIM is only an offer obligation. It's not a delivery.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That's a good clarification. So, again, we just wanted to mention here that once these imports are actually awarded, then the ISO is really relying on that delivery of energy. It's just the same as they would for an internal generator that's scheduled and clears the market. So the other part that kind of makes this even more concerning is that once an intertie resource is actually scheduled, then that transmission is reserved for the schedule and cannot be used by any other import resource on the intertie, which can be concerning, I think. It could result in some inefficient outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about the firmness behind these transactions. So we've talked about it in some of our RA working group or RA stakeholder meetings where we indicated that anything that's shown on an RA plan for import RA should be for a monthly commitment to at least bid or offer into the ISO's market as a firm commitment to do that. But right now we're feeling like there's not really enough clarity to ensure that we know what's really behind some of these non-resource specific RA imports, because we don't actually require any seller to indicate what kind of obligation really supports that transaction. So I just put up here a little bit of a discussion on the contracts that we see happening, regularly in the other parts of WAC outside of the ISO. The WSPP agreements, there's generally like 3 different types. Could be Schedule C, Schedule B, Schedule A, and those are differences, basically firm, non-firm, energy only type of arrangements. But we don't really have a specification there on making sure that we know what's really backing that, so that could be concerning. I would note that the PUC does require that anything that's shown on RA plans for their LSEs must be a firm transaction that's backed up with reserves as well, in case it's supplied by some kind of VER or other use limited type of resource. So that could help protect us a bit on some of that, but I think we might be interested in maybe establishing this kind of a type of requirement in the tariff as well. Maybe a clarification there on that one. So let's talk a little bit about this concept. I think it's kind of interesting that some folks have brought this point up, and we've had some debates during our stakeholder meetings. I'd like to hear if the MSC has an opinion on this one. Basically, there's been some questions about if these non-specific external import resources could actually be more reliable than a internal resource. And so the argument that folks have made on some of our calls is that they assume that, if one of those resources in some pool or a BA outside of the ISO could go on outage, then they could just go and grab another resource from that, same supplier or a similar area or a different area and just bring it on the same intertie point into the ISO that they have the MIC applied to. So seems to make sense to some extent, but I think we're concerned with the concept because if it's not actually backed with the physical obligation, there might not be, a firm transaction there. There might not actually be a certainty that could deliver in the time of an emergency or a shortage or perhaps even just economically if there's higher prices outside the ISO. So that concept, I think, is an interesting one to talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, I read some about that. It struck me that there's 2 things that are being mixed together, it seemed to me. One is identifying that you've got a resource, a physical resource that can deliver or a system resource that can deliver. And B, do you have to always provide the supply from that resource? And those don't have to be the same thing. And it seems like in the CAISO requirements you have to have a specific resource you can point to, and you always have to deliver from that, even if it's a cold day in, October, and there's lots of cheaper places to get it through. The way the import RA works in the East, you have to have the resource you can designate so that if the source BA needs power, you can say, no, it's coming from my RA resource, you can't curtail it. But if it's that mild day in October where there's tons of supply, you don't have to put on a gas turbine when there's tons of capacity available. So, it seems to me, you could split those things apart and say you have to point to a resource that really is there, that you own or you have under contract, but on any given day, as long as you have that ultimately that you could use, it can come from anywhere. And I think you might split those apart and think about is the latter acceptable, or as long as you knew that they did have a resource they could turn on?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. We do want to allow for folks to allow for economic transactions to take place where things that make sense, if they can source energy cheaper, I think we want to allow for that, but we also want to ensure that if there is an emergency or shortage situation, we actually get delivery of those resources that we really need during those reliability periods, because it is fair. I think during the summer periods when we peak, it would be more important to have some of those, insured deliveries as opposed to, some have, excess, on the ISO system. So
it could be that the time you need it is in October, but the point is that they've got it if they need it, but we don't, require a gas turbine.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think we're open to that concept. I think one of to your point about the Eastern markets, there's some of them have to have an attestation that they won't be sold to another resource, another entity, and they also could have a firm recallability in emergency situations. So there's some provisions like that we're hoping to kind of explore a little bit more.
All of that would be consistent with saying you have to designate a physical resource,
right?
But you can always supply from whatever's.
That's right. And so I think we're certainly open to that concept. We're not trying to say that, if you show something for RA, you have to run that resource. We just want the bids to come in, those offers that we need to maintain reliability to be coming into the ISO market. So as long as we can ensure that, we're open to the idea that, economics can dictate what should be dispatched, of course, we think that, but I think it's just concerning to us to think that there could be the potential that there could be, non-firm transactions that might represent some speculative supply, and if there's really the ability for us to recall that, it might not matter 99% of the time, but that 1% of the time it could represent a reliability concern.
Okay, so a couple of things. So first of all, there is some degree of substitutability within the RA structure now, right? For all resources. So absolutely. I think it's a stretch to say it's more reliable than other types of RA because it's drawn from a pool, because other types of RA could always substitute as well if they wanted to. That's true. But I totally agree with what Scott was saying, that to rigidly sort of require a specific resource all the time, just, what we really care about is production during probably a relatively small number of critical hours, and so you want some degree, and all of this is about how much ex ante certainty you can really have about performance during those hours versus ex post kind of incentives to require that they actually perform during those hours, and so underlying all of this is how much ex ante certainty can you get, and how do you, all resources have some degree of uncertainty about their ability to perform, be it an outage or a variable energy resource or an energy limited resource. And so there's only so much certainty you can create ex ante. Now, I think you can go farther than what you're doing now, but ultimately it's still, I think you need some kind of performance incentive as well.
Sure, let's go to the phones. I think we have callers.
Operator, can you put the caller through, please?
Yes, good afternoon. It's Mark Holman. Chris, I wonder if you could just back up to slide 5, because I think the dialogue's been good, but I think there's one issue that's not really being covered here, which is understand the benefits of substitutability if there's a more economic resource or the resource you committed goes on a forced outage, for example, and understand the performance measurements for trying to get the resources that have committed to perform. But I think there's a bigger overarching issue here, which is in the first point on slide 5, non-resource specific RA, providing energy bids that are not supported by physical supply and or a firm transmission reservation. I think the key issue is the words, at the time that the resource adequacy commitment is made. In other words, what we're seeing out there, based on the current framework, is this ability for someone, a marketer, for example, to sell RA for an upcoming month, for an upcoming year, and they don't have the capacity at the time that they sell it. They're just making a speculative bet that they're going to go buy maybe firm energy and firm transmission on the day if they get dispatched for energy. And they may or may not be successful in doing that. And any performance incentives aren't going to solve the fact that if you get to a hot summer day or a cold winter day and they can't find it, there's nothing they can do, but you've compensated them for resource adequacy that hasn't been provided. You've crowded out other real physical resource adequacy. And I think that's the larger issue here. And maybe with a couple examples. If an entity sells, let's say, 100 megawatts of RA in an intertie, and it's non-resource specific, is it okay for them to simply sell that betting on that when they put an energy offer into the day-ahead energy market, if they get dispatched for energy, they will then go look for firm energy and firm transmission? Or is the requirement and where you want to get to from a policy perspective that resource adequacy is actually real physical capacity commitments at the time that the sale of resource adequacy is made? And I can give you a couple other examples that I think are the gaps that really need to be addressed.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think that's
what we've been talking about, Mark.
Yeah,
you
that's
have to point to a physical resource, which means you have to point to a physical resource at the time you sell the RA, but then you can deliver the energy from whatever happens to be most economic in each hour.
And I think that's the key point is I agree with you, Dr. Harvey. I think it's at the time that you sell the RA or at the time that the supply plan is due. I think there's a second piece that's a gap, and I'll use an example. If an entity has let's say a 500 megawatt local load outside of the CAISO, and they have 500 megawatts of capacity, and they don't have any expectation of having surplus capacity, you've also got the gap of them pointing at that 500 megawatts of supply that's going to be used to serve local demand if they can't find replacement supply in the short-term market. So I think there's two pieces in that forward-looking time frame, that you're pointing at a physical resource, including a system resource that is being committed to serve RA, and you're making a commitment that there's a reasonable expectation that that is surplus to any native load or external obligations. Otherwise, you just get this, someone's got 500 megawatts of resources, they got 500 megawatts of external load, they sell 500 megawatts of resource adequacy to California LSEs, and then they shop for backfill energy, and on the one day they can't find it, they don't perform on the 500 megawatts of capacity they sold because they needed to serve load. So it's not only got to be identified, I think, in that forward time frame, but also has to be recognized as being surplus to native load or other obligations outside of the CAISO. I think the replacement, being able to replace it and get the dispatch efficient makes a lot of sense, but I think just having it as firm or WSTP Schedule C isn't enough. It's that need for that forward commitment.
Well, Mark, I'd say I do agree with that. I think that's the double counting issue that we're talking about where there. It's more than the speculative supply issue. So I do believe that that's touching on that issue in particular because, you know, if we don't have that type of agreement or attestation that hasn't been sold to another party, they could just be relying on that and then hoping that they could either, you know, not have their loads be needing to actually utilize those resources, or they could be hoping that they could just go and source that as a, you know, other type of energy purchase, spot energy or other type of firm contract from someone else. And all that may be fine for most of the time, but if in the time that it isn't okay, you know, when we have a shortage across the West, that could be a time when we really, you know, run into a trouble there. So. Go ahead, Jim.
I guess, yeah. My reaction, it seems like I worry that it's a bit of a slippery slope to try to evaluate surplus conditions or surplus capacity.
Yeah.
And, you know, in an ideal world, in a circumstance like that, they have to, the CAISO would have first priority on that RA capacity, and they would have to deal with the fact that they're forced to export still, even if it means curtailing their own load.
That's right. But I think we're not really trying to intend that the ISO would be getting in the business of trying to, you know, interpret different resource mixes and you know, IRPs and other things where these resources are committed, you know, to other areas. I think what we would think might solve this would be that along normal lines of like an attestation that they're not actually being sold to a third party or relied upon by another entity. I think that's more done the direction that we're getting to, but I think those are all fair points, Jim. Mark, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, no, I think that was a good discussion. I think identifying what the resource is at the time and having to show that, and then some way of just, whether it's an attestation or some form of saying, you know, this is expected to be surplus, or we anticipate this being surplus to native load. Of course, you can always have something that goes wrong. You know, the unit goes out of service, or a combination of a really high load and supply getting knocked out of service. You don't want to limit your supply to the extent that you don't get the liquidity. I would say the one last point I would just make is while it might not matter during certain months or certain periods, I still think it still begs the question as to whether any capacity that's sold as RA, even if it's in a month that it has a low risk of mattering, should it really be transacting as RA without a capacity commitment behind it? Should you really be allowing, what are you achieving if your load serving entities are compensating for RA and all they're not really covering off forward capacity, they're just shifting, leaning on the short-term market from the CAISO to a marketer? Is that really achieving anything? So I don't think it's as narrow as, well, let's worry about it just in the key months or the key hours. I think it's really that resource adequacy is something that you're expected to have capacity that you're committing to provide that service, and that's what you're being compensated for.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think that's a fair point, and that kind of gets to the last bullet where we're concerned that could displace internal resources, and that those dollars that should be going to resources that are providing true reliability and availability to the ISO might be being offset or otherwise displaced by some cheaper intertie resources that don't actually have that true intent of being a real available resource to the ISO. But it is hard for us to know what's actually happening. And I would also note that, there are concerns from certain stakeholders and others that, CPUC and other entities that have said, we need to balance this concern with the cost impacts and liquidity issues as well. Obviously, we don't want to lock this down so much that we create, supply issues completely, and create some of those concerns about increasing costs. So we have to really think hard about what's the right thing to do on this. And I'm going to move on to some of the other slides where we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we have for possible changes. So again, obviously specification of the import resource source, would that help? Would it be necessary to require attestation? We talked a little bit about those things already. Would it be all right to maybe add some kind of requirement to specify what kind of agreement's really backing a transaction, if to even qualify? These are all kind of all related, interrelated, similar type of concepts, but maybe just to differing extents. And then,
hey, Chris,
sure, go ahead.
Back there, there's, and Powerex touched on this in their comments on our day-ahead market enhancements.
What slide?
Right here, your second bullet here, the firmness of the agreement.
Yeah.
I think we're mixing kind of two things because you might have or maybe not, but you might have an agreement for a specific specific resource behind an RA import, but that resource then might actually not be as firm as agreement to buy power out of a system under a WSPP contract, because that if it's contingent on the resource, sure, it's resource specific and you've got a real resource, but then you might not get the power if there's an outage of the resource, where there's other agreements where they're going to have a firm commitment to deliver the power irrespective of the outage of a particular resource.
Right, and that's exactly what some stakeholders have mentioned as well. So I think we need to recognize that concept, that I think perhaps if we required them to tell us what kind of agreement's backing that might, open that up for us to understand if that really is a reliable, type of resource. I think. Does that make sense, Brad? I mean, what do you think? I think if we had some type of requirement to, tell us what type of firmness you have behind that RA showing, that might be an improvement over what we have today, but still allow for folks to, actually be able to use non-resource specific resources in these type of contracts.
Yeah, I guess it depends on, if it's resource specific though, do they have requirements to replace it, substitute like we do for outages of internal resources?
That's a good question. So I think for the non-resource specific stuff, they don't have those kind of requirements. But if we were to require resource specificity, we could also look into those kind of things as well. Others have mentioned that we could look into some of the other like mitigation of imports and things like that. That gets into a lot more open-ended discussion. So it's just a lot of things to think about what would be the right thing to do here. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. This is the last slide I think that I have. Yeah. So a couple other ideas that we were thinking about. Some of these might be more appropriate than others, but one of the ones we're keenly interested in is trying to explore if a real-time bidding requirement for all megawatts of imports would be necessary or would be helpful to address some of these concerns. Because right now, it's, again, as we spoke to earlier, if these imports don't actually clear the day-ahead market, then they're relieved of any further obligation. If we really need them in the real time, obviously, things don't change that much between day-ahead and real time, but sometimes they might. And if we don't get those bids, we might not be able to utilize those resources. They can go and sell somewhere else, and you have no access to that resource that's been actually shown to us for RA purposes. So I don't know, does anyone on the MSC have any opinions on that concept? I would also note that we have to really think about, how that interacts with some of the things like the EIM participation as well in real time.
Okay. So I wanted to ask your opinion, Chris, about this, because the stakeholders were divided on this in their concepts, in their comments. So what type of real physical resources outside of the ISO, if they were required to offer in real time if they hadn't been selected day ahead, what sort of real resources would that be a problem for? And so we might thereby shrink the pool of potential RA resources outside. So this is an example of a general trade-off raised over and over again, that is, if we add more requirements on external resources, there are going to be fewer of them available at a time that we need them, was a current concern of some. But at any rate, what real physical resources would this be a problem for? I don't have a scheduled day ahead, but you want me to make an offer in real time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can speak to what type of resources it would be a problem for. I think it would just generally put an additional burden on any supply that was provided. So, of course, I think, to bid in the real time.
A combined cycle that needs a couple hours to start. I mean, lots of resources. Internal resources don't have to be available on 10 minutes notice. That's not true. That's not the way it works. They have startup times. They have minimum run times. We're going through the whole 15-minute scheduling in the day-ahead market because we have Cascade Hydro that says they can set it up day ahead, but not in real time. So, I mean, it seems to me that no resources, there are very few resources that have a 24/7 offer, even internally, because they have to be startup and be available, and they have minimum downtimes. So I think we should keep in mind, there should be comparability with internal resources, but internal resources aren't infinitely flexible either.
So internally, you have to be offer, but subject constraints, so they know your status. The external resources right now, you don't have visibility, and you can't consider their ramp and startup. That's the issue, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the other ideas about and the day-ahead real-time sort of issues of the markets are just different for imports as they are.
Yeah, and that's one of the ideas about maybe if we were able to, get resource specificity on imports, we could look into those type of, resource characteristics. It would probably require us to have something like this similar type of master file information on hand for any type of specific resource outside, like a dynamically scheduled or pseudo-tied resource where we know all those physical characteristics and we treat it exactly like it's an internal resource. And I definitely fully agree with you, Scott, about your points about, obviously we're not saying that this is like a, immediate ramping capability or turn on, and all those type of things are all or startup. I think those are all important concepts we need to think about more and how that interacts with some of these possible changes. But, that's why I said some of these may be more applicable than others. I think, one of the other ones we had an idea of is what if we were required monthly firm transmission reservations to qualify? And that also goes to that point about, if we require some of these additional more stringent requirements, then we're going to also increase the cost to those suppliers. And we need to think about, is necessary? Is that appropriate? So we're not really, wedded to a certain concept here at this point, but we're just trying to explore these a little bit more and try to understand how to best balance all these different needs. And it's very complicated. So we're trying to think a little bit harder about all this and come up with a really good proposal for our next revised draw.
Even if you didn't go to the physical, know the exact resources of the system, you could still have a requirement that, okay, if you're RA, you have to offer into stock 4 hours in advance. And you have to be available within at least 4 hours. And that might be consistent with, if we see that's our flexibility need, but have it for everybody, then you apply the same thing to internal resources. But you have to think, do you really need that flexibility? Do we really need that or not? How much flexibility do we need?
Yeah,
or should we be buying more 30-minute reserves or something ahead for when we need it, as opposed to all RA resources all the time?
Yeah, Chris, if I can add, I think a lot of this is going to be tied to where we end up designing the day-ahead market as well. If we have the flexible ramping product in the day-ahead market, then we would be able to, both clear the energy and the flexibility, uncertainty needs in the day-ahead market. And I think as long as you didn't get a commitment then in the day-ahead market, we wouldn't necessarily need a real-time must-offer obligation, because we would be ensured that we have the flexibility that we need going into real-time, because that would all be established in the day-ahead time frame. So I kind of see that as being, pretty tied to what we end up with here.
Yeah, that's a good point, Greg. I think that we, probably would, if we were to look at those kind of, concepts in the day-ahead enhancements, and we had something like some of these other attestations or requirements for, explaining the firmness of them, maybe we wouldn't need to get to that real-time must-offer obligation or some kind of other additional, monthly reservations or things like that could add a bunch of additional costs. But at least then we might have more certainty that there's actually to Mark's point from PowerX, that there's actually a real physical resource or a source there that's specified and not double counted at the time of the showing, rather than just trusting that that's going to happen and materialize in the actual real time or, day ahead time frame, more operational horizon.
I wanted to raise an issue that I've had some people tell me is related to import RA, and other people have said it's not. But this sort of stylized fact that there are hours, the market in California has negative prices, and yet we continue to import large amounts of power, which always struck me as curious. And I've had some people tell me that it had to do with the sort of rigidities that the import RA had imposed, that they sort of felt the need to continue to import this firm RA, even though market conditions might have implied reducing it. And I know people like Kaiser have said it's just some other strange aspect of the market not really trading efficiently at the borders during those circumstances. But so I'm just wondering if any stakeholders have a sense that there are conditions in which imports are sort of being forced into the market, even though they're not necessarily economic, because of some RA delivery requirement, or if there's just something else going on.
It's Mark Smith of Calpine. For our imports, Jim, no, that's not an issue. They're bid economically and they're dispatched economically. I suspect the problem resides with self-scheduled imports from resources that are price insensitive.
I would tend to agree with that, Mark.
And then we're into the mystery of why you have inflexibly scheduled resources, which is always kind of
why are they leaving money on the table?
Part of the flexible RA discussion.
And that also kind of goes to some of the points I was making about we don't really know what agreements are backing some of these things. So if there's a bilateral transaction or some type of other PPA or other contractual obligation that ensures that those resources are kind of must take, they're going to self-schedule regardless of the price, and maybe someone else is on the hook for that difference, the difference in the market price and their bilateral transaction. That's kind of where my mind goes when I start thinking about that a little bit. And we don't really know what's behind some of those, so we can't, we don't see the pricing behind it either, so it's really hard to kind of quantify or analyze that sort of thing.
Okay, in a word then, some sort of dumb contract, and you hope that with these incentives, such contracts won't be signed in the future, but in the short term, you might see some counterintuitive stuff.
Yeah, perhaps.
Well, I mean, they could be meeting the RPS, right? And then they continue flowing even if the price is negative.
Yeah.
Or if they were getting, but, you know, a couple of
Wait, turn on your mic.
also mentioned that, you know, and this was in the context of 15-minute pricing, but that's relevant to why you might be flowing, because they said, in fact, 15-minute scheduling still wasn't available outside the CAISO. So is that part of the problem? That because they can't schedule on a 15-minute basis, they don't want the risk of being, you know, of not flowing, and so they end up flowing for the whole hour?
Yeah, I think the hourly block, you know, intertie imports that is perhaps part of that as well. I'm not exactly sure either, but it seems like that could have part of you know, to do with that, and perhaps in those other, you know, just their transmission contracts or transmission agreements, they might be buying it hourly or something like that. That, you know, that could be a significant amount of cost that might actually make it more economic to just flow the whole hour rather than cut that import. So depending on the pricing, but on the phone, let's go to the phones, please.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of things. One of which is for the firm import, remember it could be Palo Verde, so there are contracts for nuclear generation that comes in. In addition, there are Hoover contracts that might be just coming in. Finally, if you're trying to think about forward, meeting your needs on a forward basis, you might buy energy. Let's say you can get 5-cent energy in the forward market for the Q3, and that could meet your needs. So then you might execute that contract. Personally, I think we've had this conversation, I would prefer firm energy than to buying import RA that bids at $1,000. So you have a trade-off, especially when you're trying to deal with bilateral markets and contracting in the forward space, in the year-ahead space. So we find that from my perspective, a number of people aren't ready to commit in the year-ahead space, in part because a lot of it's hydro and they don't know their hydro position. So from an RA perspective, we can't necessarily get that in the year-ahead space. So people do the forward energy contracts. So that's why coming into the month, you might actually be having imports coming in. So I just wanted to clarify that it's not dumb contracting always. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. And yeah, I think we recognize that there's, you know, valid reasons for doing all different sorts of contractual arrangements, as you mentioned. And I think we're encouraged to see that the PUC is interested in this one, and obviously what you guys have been talking about with the firm energy. I think we understand the viewpoint there, and perhaps that's why some of these other type of arrangements where we just understand what the firmness or backing of the transaction really is might be helpful for us to still allow for flexibility and you know, not have drastic impacts on supply and pricing as well. So definitely open to exploring those concepts too.
Okay, and then I just wanted to note that we have indicated that we think actually the pricing is really important to consider in this, because you could be able to point to any resource you wanted to, but if you're bidding $1,000, to me, that's really not that useful. In addition to which, since we might be moving to $2,000 bids, you know, I personally would like to have the firm energy coming in than $1,000 or $2,000 bids at our border. So thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Jim?
Michelle, I agree with you, but I mean, I guess the way the RA system has been set up here, that there's two separate problems. You know, RA was not meant to be a hedge against energy purchases, and so firm energy is really important. RA was meant to be something else.
Right, but so I'm confused about this because we've also have flexible RA, so we make it a bidding obligation. So I'm kind of confused of what exactly do we want here? Do we want it all just bidding into the market? And if we can't control the bids, that concerns me. As opposed to, I always thought you guys wanted firm energy contracts so you could be sure that it's there for a hedge. So I'm kind of confused what we're aiming for here.
Well,
no, RA was not meant to be a substitute for energy hedges. I'm just articulating this. I mean, there's still large debates about all this, but it's meant to be a ex ante evaluation of resource adequacy, of sort of a supply-demand balance of physical capability against the expected demand. So it's more of a reliability concept than it is an economic price concept. And there was all sorts of considerations about whether to have a lower strike price and different incentive mechanisms and things. But in general, it seemed like the stakeholder process did not want to get into the energy procurement when the RA thing was developed.
Yeah, and I think Frank Warlock feels as if we made a mistake there. And I just want to note, utilities were 85% of the load. They did have the energy and the capacity on it. And I'm finding that we're having more of an issue now that the energy is not on the RA, because you're getting bidding behavior that I think is strategic.
Well, so you can certainly buy your RA and energy from the same resource in a bundle, which I think was happening quite extensively. And maybe it's happening less now, and that's leading to some of the problems. But that just there's no requirement that the energy hedges be purchased from the RA. I guess it's just the important point was that the energy hedges are really important, and that's sort of the part that deals with the system market power more than RA does. And RA just was not designed to deal with that energy pricing problem.
Right, but I'm just saying that if you're going to bring in RA, I would prefer it to be real firm energy than just a bid, and especially a bid at $1,000. Okay,
do you have any follow-up? Okay. So yeah, Michelle, this is Chris again. So I mean, I get it if we want to have this, your idea of getting, cheap firm energy contracts account for RA, and that might be better in your opinion than the, high priced, possibly speculative type of RA imports. I definitely understand that view of it, but there's also the concern of, overgen and when we have too much PMIN on the system, if we're having all these self-schedules come into the ISO as well, we want to think about that too. I mean, obviously we got to allow for economic transactions, but to the point that Jim was making earlier and Ben as well, it's like, are we really wanting some of those resources to be flowing all the time? And what happens when there's these negative prices inside the ISO? Is it really, it's uneconomic to have that happen? And
I absolutely agree. But my point is that if we don't do anything about them bidding at $1,000, then what have we done? We've identified the resource, but unless you address the pricing aspect of it, you just have resources that can bid at $1,000. They've met their obligation, they don't get rain penalties, and they don't get dispatched. So
yeah, I certainly understand the concern. I don't have a great idea of how to address that one at the moment.
Chris, this is Brad.
Brad, go ahead.
Do we know that the following situation isn't occurring, that you don't need every resource in every hour of the year, that RA is purchased from import resources that say it's purchased, that the source behind the import is a hydro resource, and so it's valuable during the peak hours of the year, and that the LSEs are simply just bidding that import in a lot of when there's more supply available during the non-peak hours, finding cheaper supply, bidding that into the market, and then bidding the RA at high prices at $1,000 during the non-peak periods of the year, just to preserve its use. And then in that case, sure, the RA is being bid in at $1,000, but there's something else that we're not seeing because it's non-RA being bid in at a more quote-unquote reasonable price.
Well, yeah, Brad, I think that's kind of to the point we were talking about earlier with, Scott and others have mentioned that there needs to be ability for people to shift these resources if it's economic to do so for energy purposes. So that could be the case, and that's really kind of to where we're getting at with this slide, where we're talking about what kind of analysis could we do. I don't think we have a great sense of exactly what would allow us to understand if that's really occurring or not. BMM has done some analysis on some of this as well. But again, I think that's a fair point. That could very well be happening, Brad. If anybody has a great idea of how we can analyze this stuff, please let me know. I'm all ears. I think that's about all I have for today. This is obviously going to be a lot longer discussion. We're going to probably have to come back and talk about more. So if anybody has ideas or ever wants to chat about this offline, let me know.
So, Chris, I want to ask about, so bullet 2, so what are the obligations for internal resources when they're energy limited? If the energy limited RA, so 6 cities mentioned the case of Hoover Dam, what it could only produce 6 hours and as an external, it wouldn't qualify under this. What happens to internal CAISO resources when they're energy limited? How do they get counted for RA?
Yeah, so if there's use limitations, they can still qualify, up to their must-offer obligation would just reflect that kind of use limitation.
Okay.
So right now we have contracts that are shown for import RA, like perhaps the Hoover contract or Palo Verde's, those kind of contracts where it's perhaps like a 5 by 8, 5 to 8 by 8 hour, similar where those must-offer obligations really only apply to those hours that they're contractual obligated for. So. And again, that does meet our needs when we have obviously the shaping of the load curve. If we don't need those perhaps during the middle of the night. But the idea is really here is trying to at least provide some greater comparability with the internal RA provisions where we have, generally a 24 by 7. But of course, we do have a number of types of use limited or fuel limited resources. So again, exactly to Scott's point earlier, I think that's fair. We recognize that. We're not saying that everybody should all have a 24 by 7 must offer obligation. Okay. So that, it's just more to think about on that piece. But that one's perhaps one of the ones that maybe not as applicable here. It could be for some resources, perhaps if we have resource specific and there's not a use limitation on that resource, then we maybe want to have that kind of a requirement, perhaps. But I don't think we're very firm on any of these ideas quite yet.
Yeah, and just to add a little to that, so we do have a bit of a different construct for the import RA resources. We do allow for subset of hours contracts for those, which basically defines their must-offer obligation. They're either, peaking contracts or, 8 or 16-hour contracts. Basically, they align with the MCC buckets under the CPUC's RA program for imports, but we don't have that for internal resources. So, we are the CCE3 enhancements that are going in place actually this month, and it'll be effective starting May 1st. Those changes essentially change the requirements for use limited RA resources where internal resources would have the 24 by 7 must offer obligation, but now they have the opportunity cost to ensure that we're, efficiently dispatching them within their use limitations. So they still would have to meet the must offer obligation, and we're relying on the market to make sure that we can dispatch them efficiently.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That's a good note. I think that is a bit of a departure from where we are, today. Or actually, we're now into that new paradigm where we can actually get those resources to be bidding with those opportunity costs all the time and getting kind of closer to this 24 by 7 from all different types of resources internal to ISO. So that's one of the reasons we're looking at this kind of potential option as well. If we had resource specificity for imports, we could, apply those same type of bidding structures that we're doing for the internal resources as well.
The other thing I wanted to ask about, so in the proposal there was mention of maybe making a 15-minute requirement for scheduling and not just 1 hour, but that didn't appear here. Has that been sort of dropped because of the 15-minute day-ahead stuff day-ahead market enhancements is not going forward immediately?
It's not generally just because of that. I think the broader reasoning behind why we're not really presenting that as another option right now, again, is just that we got a lot of feedback from folks that is kind of infeasible for external resources. You really have to be dynamically scheduled. I think actually Mark provided some good comments from Calpine about how that would work for some of their resources, how it just wouldn't be feasible to operate those unless they actually had a pseudo-tie or a dynamically scheduled setup. So that kind of thing, it would severely limit the pool of resources. So I think we're shying away from that concept as well, but not directly related to anything with the day-ahead granularity. And I think we have something on the phone still, so let's go back to the phones.
Lauren, can you go ahead and put that last caller through, please?
Hi, this is Victor from SCE. I just have a quick question. I think I heard Chris, you mentioned many times about potential ideas and the different options. I think also given discussions on this issue, different issues about speculative suppliers and all of that and concerns around that. So I'm just wondering, are you open to include the price cap in the scope of this initiative at this moment? So, stakeholders can have a full discussion on the price cap. Because I noticed that you kind of, excluded that in the first paper. Maybe you would be more willing to explore the ideas around the price cap. That's my question.
That's a fair question. I think we indicated in the initial straw proposal, part 1, where we talked about this, that we were not looking into that. That was going to be out of scope for this initiative. So I think we're going to really tread that line here as well, continue to say that, because I don't think that really this is an appropriate type of a part of the discussion to talk about that. I know that, obviously CPUC, Michelle has mentioned that. That's very important as well. I think that we're perhaps open to discussing it further, but I don't know if the RA enhancements is perhaps the right forum for that. That would just be my initial response. I'd have to, discuss it a little bit further in terms. I don't know. Any comments from the
this is Brad.
gallery?
This is Brad. Like Keith Casey said at the last board meeting, we're going to be looking at price justification for imports at the interties, but like as Jim was just saying a minute ago, that RA's a capacity thing, not an energy price thing. In my mind, I think that the bidding high at the interties for RA, that the pure price ramifications get mixed up with the concern that that's a strategy for having speculative supply. So concerns. That's not necessarily the price per se. It's just that bidding high is a way of not getting dispatched often and not having to perform on the RA. So that those are slightly different issues.
Yeah, and I think that I would agree with that. It's just generally a capacity issue, and obviously the pricing is important, but I don't know if the price caps kind of concept really fits in with the RA enhancements initiative. I think that would probably be more something that Brad Shop would probably want to pick up and talk about further, as he noted. So.
Okay, but I think at some time, but at the same time, you have to recognize the fact that this is about import RA. I would tend to agree that everything is based on economics and for energy. But we are talking about import RA that receives additional revenue, that low going to pay. So to me, it should be discussed, whether there should be a separate cap for RA or import RA resources. This is my thought.
Well, this is Brad too, and it seems to me that if the load serving entities are concerned about RA bidding high at the interties, then they shouldn't be just contracting for pure capacity from the RA imports. They should contract for energy also and come up with an energy price and contractually come up with the requirements for what they bid in.
Well, there's option there. That's true. I think that's definitely the option. But I think, we are talking about just the market design piece. So I think, to me, if we just stick to the theoretical economic point of view that the guys just mentioned, then I was just trying to say, there is some thought about whether the employer should have a different price cap. I just bring that point up. So.
All right. Well, I think we will take a note of that and think about it a little bit more, but I don't think we have a great response at this point beyond what we've already stated. So thanks for the comments. Appreciate it. Anything else on the phones or in the room on this topic? Everyone want to get out of here? We're a little late, so we'll turn it back over to you guys to wrap it up. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So we'll hear a lot more, I'm sure, from Chris and the rest of the RA team in future meetings. The next meeting is scheduled for June 7th on a Friday. We'll firm that up. We don't have any opinions coming up, so that's the next time you'll hear from us, and we look forward to seeing you then. So, operator, this concludes the MSC meeting. We can close the lines.
Thank you, Lauren.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.